Let's, whilst we're standing up, can we have a word of prayer from the person that requested too?
Heavenly Father, in the name of Jesus, we want to thank you this morning as we continue to acknowledge you that we love you, Lord. We want to thank you, mighty God, for this gathering. We ask you, Holy Spirit, to lead us. We ask you, sweet Spirit, to be in us, mighty God, so that we can understand, as you know our needs, as we know our desire. Father, we thank you. We thank you for everything. We thank you for our speakers. We thank you, mighty God, for the leadership. We thank you for each and everybody who is here. In Jesus' mighty name, we honor you. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. I would want to call upon Celia for, and on behalf of us, to give us the housekeeping. Can I leave you the time for you now?
You can, yes. Hi, thank you. My name's Celia. I work at LAS, and
First of all, for giving us the place to come and do our session here. Before we go any further, we've got some pledging forms for our guests and members who are here, which will pass them on. Those who want to contribute to ZA in support of the asylums. These are the forms that I'll pass them around. Those who may want to make some contributions for that. Let's all welcome Pelagia Zigangwe. She's the coordinator for Leicester Province Center, and I will leave her the time for her now. Can you also welcome me and give a pump pump?
I don't know what to say. I'm so pleased. I was not expecting this. It was a journey to organize this function today, to have it like this. I want to thank you, everybody. Can I say thank you and welcome? May dear God bless you for supporting my organization. And I want to thank Philip so much. He came the long way to support the organization. It was a journey to plan this function. I welcome you. The Zimbabwe asylum seekers and the refugee and the Zimbabwe people, we are privileged to have Philip Barclay. He worked in Zimbabwe for 3 years, 4 years maybe, in the capital in Harare. So he's the man who is going to tell us about Harare. I've got a house in Harare, but for the past 8 years, I don't know what Harare is about. I can only hear from Philip. I don't know my family, what is happening. I can rely with Philip today, what is happening in Harare. So we give the time to Philip. I'm not going to take much time of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I can only say I'm utterly humbled and delighted that so many people have come today. Pelagia has been magnificent at organising this function. We met in London a couple of months ago and we were talking about coming to Leicester. Now I live in Turkey, so when Pelagia says it's a journey, it quite literally is a journey. In some sense I've been travelling here since 2 o'clock on Monday morning, so I really am, there have been some stops along the way, but I'm really feeling how great it is to have arrived here and seen such a fantastic audience. I'm going to spend the first part of our time. I'll read you some passages from my book, which is called Zimbabwe, Years of Hope and Despair, which deals with what Pelagia was telling you about my biography. I'll try not to take too much time, but there are some episodes you're going to want to hear about, which I'll tell you about. I know you're all experts, so I'll skip most of the introductions and explanations and context which I give to audiences generally. After I've read some passages, I think the most important part of our session is for you to make comments, enter the discussion, ask the questions which you have. I'm not promising I can answer the questions you have, but I'll happily try if it makes sense for me to do so. But I'm always delighted with any feedback on the book and on the experiences I describe, so it would be wonderful to have that. The heart of my book is about the 2008 elections. I was one of the international election observers for those elections. I was attached to the British Embassy. I was working as a British diplomat. So I had a really unique opportunity to go out across the whole country On election day, I was touring around polling stations, seeing what was going on, and through the subsequent months of, which I think you know turned out pretty badly, I was there as well, observing at first hand, in often quite painful detail, what was happening. So I'll jump straight to that, because I think that's maybe what you as a group are most interested in, and I do want to respect the time we've got. So I'll start by reading you a little passage about what it was like to be an observer on election day in March 2008. I'm sure you all remember the build-up. We were all kind of dreading that the government that had been in power for so long would just stay in power, and we didn't really expect very much was going to change. But actually we were ready for a big surprise. It was still dark when I woke at 5 a.m. on 29th of March, Zimbabwe's election day. I had travelled down to Masvingo the night before so that I could reach a rural polling station by the time it opened at 7 a.m. But even pre-positioned, I had to start early. The road east from Masvingo was dark, but wide and empty. As usual, the Zimbabwean night was warm and comforting to me. I was excited to be part of such an important day in such a strange but wonderful country. Every few kilometres I saw activity at polling stations. Most made use of school buildings, but some were being set up in tents along the roadside to service rural areas too thinly populated even to merit a school. As usual, work was divided along gender lines. Women were stirring up fires to cook a breakfast of tea and sadza. Men were moving papers around, trying to look important. Just as they had said they would, tens of thousands of polling officers had slept uncomfortably at their posts to guard their supplies of papers and boxes, and to be sure they were ready to open at 7 a.m. The car lights showed the way ahead clearly, but the sides of the road were in darkness. I started to glimpse people, thousands of people walking to vote. They were hard to see as they generally wore dark clothing, but I could sense their movement somehow. They weren't walking fast or racing to get ahead of each other, but rolling along steadily, using a minimum of scarce energy in great numbers. It was the people of Zimbabwe, rejecting passivity, rejecting a fatalistic assumption of a grim destiny. They had woken in the middle of the night, eaten breakfast if food was available, and begun to walk, perhaps 15 kilometres, to join a queue that might take 4 hours to clear. So great was their desire to shape the nation's decision on its future. I marvelled at the resilience and stamina of so many people, with poor shoes, insufficient food, and little intellectual cause for optimism. Where did their basic desire to vote come from? Did they all know something? A collective secret, a shared hope that I did not? I sensed that something was happening that my brain had not thought possible. As I say, I spent the day touring around polling stations and seeing what was going on. And I'll skip on to the evening. In the evening I went to watch the votes being counted. So I was, I think I can say fairly proudly, I was one of the first people to have a good idea of what was happening in this election. And I'll tell you now what that was like. It was 6 p.m. Dusk was falling and everything in Zaka was quiet. The smoke of cooking fires rose only slowly through the still air. Everybody who was going to vote had done so. But the count could not begin until 7 p.m, so polling staff were taking the opportunity to cook some evening sadza, sit quietly with a cigarette or stretch out for a nap. Night fell and it was suddenly pitch black. With so many demands on Zimbabwe's scarce electricity that night, there was none for Zaka. The embassy tells its staff not to walk around at night, but I felt happy doing so. Zaka had felt benign to me all day. I couldn't see any danger coming from the people I'd met. In the darkness, I heard rather than saw people gathering at the registration office where I decided to observe the count. There were some observers in 2005 who were locked in their counts until dawn, so I hid my mobile and some food and water in my day sack and went inside. At the centre of the room was a large trestle table surrounded by a dozen participants in the count, the returning officer and his assistants, agents of the parties, an independent observer, and me. The returning officer, Tobias, worked slowly and carefully through the instructions in his manual. The guidance was long and complicated and hard to read by candlelight. Tobias stood gripping the edge of the table, looking intently down, moving the process along one small step at a time. More than 2 hours later, Tobias showed no sign of losing bladder control, but I was not feeling so comfortable. I tried following people who disappeared occasionally through a door in the back and found there were toilets there, which hadn't been cleaned in a long time. I started making regular visits so that I could text reports back to colleagues in Harare who emailed them on to London. I had to be concise though, as the stench was appalling. Sometime after 10 p.m, Tobias suddenly told the slumbering polling officers that they could now count the votes for each candidate. The women sprang to life and grabbed ballots chaotically, shouting out and flinging papers at each other. Mugabe, Makoni, Shvangarai. Tobias tried to referee the frenzy and finally persuaded his colleagues to collaborate in producing 3 piles. One was just a few papers. The second was a decent pile, an inch tall. The third was a tottering tower. Even after everything I'd seen, I was still sure that the large pile had to be Mugabe's. But I was so wrong. The smallest pile was Simba Makoni's, 11 votes. The middling pile was Mugabe's, 44 votes. Amazingly, incredibly, the tallest pile belonged to Morgan Shvangarai. The polling officer, drooping with fatigue, after 16 hours of work, kept losing count. At one point, she became tongue-tied at 127 and had to start again. She sighed desperately, but finally managed to finish her count, 167. Shvangarai had won about 3/4 of the vote. It was midnight when Tobias finally said we could all go. I stepped out of the stuffy building into the rich darkness outside. There were a few lights 300 metres away, in a building where results were being added together, but otherwise I was surrounded by the kind of dense blackness in which I could hardly see my own hand. The Milky Way stretched out over me. I just stood staring upwards, not really sure what I wanted to do next. I jumped when a policeman, who had walked very quietly up behind me, whispered in my ear, "Mr. Philip, we are so pleased you are here, but do you really think there is hope?" For the first time in more than 2 years in Zimbabwe, I thought the answer might be yes. So that was election day 2008, and I think we all know that ushered in a few days where we felt a tremendous hope, a tremendous sense that maybe something was going to change. I think we all felt that we saw quite quickly that the MDC had replaced ZANU-PF as the biggest party in Parliament, and we all got a strong impression, as I got first hand there, of the fact that Morgan Shvangarai had also beaten Mugabe in the presidential vote. That area, Zaka and Mashvingo, where I was an area which had always voted Mugabe up till this point. So it was very significant to me that 3/4 of the voters had chosen Shvangarai. I couldn't see how in a place like that he could get such a strong vote and not win overall. But unfortunately, that hope that we felt wasn't the end of the story, and a quite substantial and brutal campaign of violence was rolled out against the communities and the people who'd supported Morgan Shvangarai. I carried on working as an election observer, touring around the country and seeing more and more of the victims of these attacks, and in some cases getting caught up in the attacks myself. And I'll read you now about another visit. This is again to Mashvingo in June 2008, so this is skipping on a couple of months when this campaign of violence was really at its height. At that moment, the provincial chair at the... I should say, by the way, some of these, the 2 passages I'm about to read are quite graphic and upsetting. So if anyone doesn't want to hear it, or they're worried about their children hearing it, then you might want to take precautions. At that moment, the provincial chair at the MDC called to tell me that the party office in Gerera, near Zaka, had been firebombed. I drove as fast as possible to Zaka and went into the police headquarters. The officer in charge said he had heard nothing about an attack, but would investigate immediately. The officer was a superb liar, and I believed him, but he was actually just trying to put me off the scent. The moment I left, he must have told 2 policemen to get to the site of the attack as quickly as possible and ensure that I couldn't inspect it. I drove on to Gerera, another 10 kilometres down a wide, empty road. I was going fast, but the police Land Rover that overtook me was going much faster. I found the place easily, partly because the building was a blackened shell, and partly because the speeding police jeep had pulled up in front of it, and 2 policemen were stationed 50 metres away, waving their arms, telling me to turn back. For the only time in the whole sordid campaign, I lost my temper and let it show. The policemen were doddering rural plods, and I wasn't scared of them. I said I was going to see the building as an accredited observer, and they couldn't stop me. I asked them who they'd arrested for this attack. They shrugged, and I called them war criminals, complicit in concealing serious human rights abuses. I took out my camera and photographed the MDC office, which was completely gutted. They told me to stop, but I could keep them away simply by swinging the camera at them and asking if I should take their pictures too. They were scared of this, knowing, I believe, they were acting in a grotesquely immoral and illegal way. They weren't the type of ZANU-PF thugs who would carry out such an attack, but they were covering it up and they knew it. I drove on to the local mission hospital, where I found a Swiss doctor. He had courageously come to Zimbabwe for a year as a volunteer, but was shaken by what he had got caught up in and was desperate to flee the country. He brought in his patient, one of 3 men who had survived the attack and the least badly injured. The survivor I spoke to was Peter, the Secretary General at the MDC in Zaka. His hands were thickly bandaged, his arms and legs raw and burned, his hair and scalp charred and blackened. He spoke very quietly, with remote, disengaged eyes. I had no doubt that he was telling me the truth. Armed men not in uniform had come to the MDC offices at 4 AM the night before. The MDC had decided that party members should sleep at the office to protect it from break-in. The armed men smashed the door down and told the 6 party members who had been sleeping there to lie down. When they started to pour petrol over the MDC men, 3 resisted and were shot. Peter hoped they had been killed instantly, because the militia then set all 6 men alight and left, blocking the doorway. Peter was able to beat the flames out with his hand and tear off his burning clothes before fleeing through the back of the building. He escaped with burns to his head, feet and hands. His 2 colleagues who had not been shot also survived, but had suffered terrible burns, 30% and 40% respectively. They were in an ambulance travelling to Mashvingo's larger hospital, but it was not at all certain that they would live. The 3 men who had all been shot, who had been shot, were all dead, one way or another. As you know, politics in Zimbabwe, like many things in Zimbabwe, is quite male-dominated. It's quite hierarchical in its structure. But women were not exempt from the violence that went on through that period. In fact, in many ways, women suffered worst, because while men could often flee from a situation, women were often stuck at home with childcare or other family care responsibilities. And there are also, of course, other horrors which women could suffer. And I interviewed some women who'd been caught up in the violence a little bit later. This is mid-June 2008, speaking to women from Harare. I went to a clinic in central Harare to meet 3 women from Epworth who had been raped and beaten. One was too broken by her experience to talk. She lay silently in her bed, her eyes darting nervously around the room, the covers pulled up to her neck. But the other 2 victims, Lisa and Yvonne, were eager to tell their story. They came to my house on 8th of June, said Lisa. They said I was an MDC supporter. I was wearing my party t-shirt and I was about to go to a rally. They burned down my house and took all my things. I ran away and hid, but the next day they came back to rape me. I knew some of them as local ZANU-PF members. They took me to a graveyard and raped me again. When I was trying to stop them, they took a hot wire and burned my hand. They looted my body like I was dead. They took my ID card and all my money. Yvonne's experience was similar, but her assault was more sustained. They came to my place at 8 PM on 9th of June. I was with my baby. They told me to surrender all my MDC regalia and cards. They took me to their base. One guy raped me on the way. They poured cold water on me all night, so I was freezing. They beat me over and over again with rods. They beat my genitals, my legs, back, buttocks and head. They called me names. They said I was a dog because I supported Shvangarai. When I spoke to the women, they were still in pain and coming to terms with new hardships. They returned to Epworth after being attacked to find their homes had been destroyed. They were also confronting the possibility of infection. A quarter of young men carry HIV, so the consequences of rape are potentially lethal. The women, who were all confident of their negative status prior to the attack, were dreading their test results. Lisa was angry. I am stressed, especially about the rape. I've contracted an STD already from the rape, and now I must wait to know about HIV. I wish God would take them all. Mugabe is a pig. I wish he would die. Yvonne was more afraid. I am stressed because I have 2 children. They poisoned my husband, and he's in the ground since 2006. Maybe I am HIV positive now because of these guys. Who will look after my children if I get AIDS? To be raped is like death. I think you know what followed those horrible incidents of violence, that the MDC reached a point where they couldn't contest the election anymore, and they withdrew, and Mugabe got his victory. A lot of people often ask me if there was any way that the MDC could perhaps have fought on, could have carried on and won that election. And the only answer I can give is the small taste of what I felt of the fear of what it was like to live in Zimbabwe at that time. I'll read you this story. I don't often read this story out, but you're kind of a special group, so I'll read this one out because I think you might understand. This is about a trip I made to Manicaland in June 2008, just before the MDC pulled out. It was a horrendous trip. I saw refugee camps full of people running from burned out villages in Nyanga right across Manicaland. I saw clinics where people were lined up on the lawn in dozens, waiting for their injuries to be tended to. And on the way back to Harare from Mutare, I stopped at Rusape. I don't know if any of you know it, but I stopped at Rusape to visit the prison, because Eric Matinenga, who is now the Constitution Minister, Eric Matinenga was being held in prison there because he was an MDC member. And I was going to try and visit him. Unfortunately, when I pulled up in front of the prison, a ZANU militia came in just behind me and blocked me in, and gave me quite a hard time. And I'll read to you a bit about what that was like. In practice, only 2 of the men engaged with me. The first, whom I shall always think of as Mr. Nasty, was in his 30s, with a thick, roughly trimmed beard. He wore his ZANU t-shirt with jeans. He demanded to know who I was, what I was doing. He demanded all my papers. At first, I tried to be self-assured. I told Mr. Nasty that I would happily give my documents to any uniformed officer, but that I did not know who he was, and so I wouldn't give him my papers. He stared at me with an intense hatred. "You are a very stupid boy. Now I need to get my gun." He moved off to his pickup. I felt a sudden teary panic that I managed to keep a lid on. Mr. Nice now appeared, a smart man in a suit and tie. He appeared to argue with his colleague, then came over to see me. "You have really upset my friend, which is not very clever. But let's try to start again." The classic interrogation routine worked perfectly. I was relieved to talk to a courteous, smart, soft-spoken man after Mr. Nasty's threat. Although I had no idea who Mr. Nice was, I gave him my ID card and other documents. He asked me politely what I was doing. I told him I was election monitoring. "Let me check what we have to do on the radio." And Mr. Nice walked off, allowing Mr. Nasty to come back at me. He probably spent no more than 20 minutes working on me, but it felt like hours. Mr. Nasty said he had spoken to the prison guards and found that I had come to see Matinenga. This was a serious abuse. Matinenga was responsible for murdering hundreds of ZANU-PF people. I was helping him. Zimbabwe was not my country, but I was interfering, acting like I ruled, trying to reverse the gains of the Liberation War, trying to enslave Africans again, give land that was liberated back to whites. I hated blacks. I was a racist, an arrogant colonial racist, and a very stupid boy. He suddenly stopped. His eyes shifted about as he considered what to do. "You are not getting out of insulting our country like this. Give me your car keys." I was so scared now that my brain moved like a reptile's. Obviously, the allegation that Matinenga was a murderer was ludicrous, as was the accusation that I was helping him. But this was not a court of law. I tried to imagine what I would do if Mr. Nasty did produce a gun. Would I give him my keys, get out of the car, abandon the illusion of safety the vehicle's metal skin gave me? But I had no idea what to do. No plan, no protocol to follow. I really wanted to cry, to say sorry, to beg these men just to let me leave. I stammered out that my embassy had told me not to give away my car keys. Mr. Nasty looked at me the way a predator looks at a sick animal. This time I really need to get my gun. I was so relieved when Mr. Nice came back at that point, but I had to work hard to hold back my tears. He said that I'd broken the rules by coming to Recife and trying to see a criminal. That was not part of the work of an election monitor. Finally, Mr. Nice said I could go, but it was his parting warning that chilled me most of all. You are just not safe here, particularly when you break the rules as you have done. We just can't guarantee that you won't be shot. You should stay in your embassy in Harare from now on. I drove off. I found it hard not to accelerate wildly down the dirt track. When I was back on the main road, I did drive much too fast for half an hour until I could persuade myself to slow down. I felt unmanned and useless, ashamed that I'd been so scared, ashamed to be so precious as to make a fuss about the nothing that had happened to me, when so many people were suffering actual pain and misery. But I did feel my own tiny share of Zimbabwe's fear. Fear of the night coming and the militias driving in, banging their weapons against car doors. The fear of being dragged off to a re-education centre for a night of agony. The fear of not knowing whether friends and family were safe. I tried to multiply what I felt by 100. I could not, but I knew as I tried that Robert Mugabe was going to win his election. Nobody could face this terror down. So after Mugabe did win his election, I think, as you know, the economy finally collapsed entirely, public services fell away, doctors stopped attending hospital, and crucially the water treatment system failed. Zimbabwe had always enjoyed excellent water, as you know. You could drink Harare's tap water when I first arrived. It was very good. But that all failed, and as a result of it failing, there was an epidemic of diseases which Zimbabwe had never experienced. I mean, when had Zimbabwe ever known a cholera outbreak? I mean, it was ludicrous for such a sophisticated country. But there was a cholera epidemic following the collapse of all public services. And I'll read you a little bit about what it was like to be there. The epidemic exploded at the beginning of the wet season in November. Zimbabwe's rains are not showers, but tropical monsoons, biblical deluges. The large quantities of human waste, filth and contamination lying in pits and on waste ground in November 2008 were washed down Harare streets where children played, flooded over the vegetables being cultivated in urban back gardens, and flowed into drains where they soon entered circulation. The failed water treatment system was no longer able to remove bacterial contaminants from wastewater. So whatever infections were washed down Harare's drains soon emerged from its taps. The number of new cases of cholera leaped rapidly from dozens to thousands per week. People started to die. The authorities set up isolation centres for the infected, but it quickly became clear that these centres were intended to isolate news of the epidemic from the outside world, rather than to provide any quarantine. I visited a cholera ward in Mbare, a densely populated suburb of Harare, with a brave and brilliant young civil society activist. We dressed smartly, parked at some distance from the hospital, and entered through a hole in the fence, avoiding the security guards at the main gate. We headed straight for the cholera ward, only to find that all the beds in the hospital had been dedicated to victims of the disease. The nurse looked at me suspiciously and told us that no observers were allowed. But we tried a bold bluff, saying that we were both related to one of the patients. Perhaps it was the effect of our smart dress or our confident manner, but she accepted this patently untrue story, and we made our way onto the ward. Row upon row of patients lay on beds or crouched uncomfortably near buckets. Some were unnaturally still. Some groaned and clutched their bellies. Porters and nurses, masked and wrapped in plastic, moved through, removing buckets of waste and mopping vomit off the floor. My activist friend stopped by one of the beds on which a man was sitting, looking relatively healthy. The patient was ready to tell his story. He had felt ill that morning and had been lucky because his family had brought him straight to the clinic. Many sufferers in his area were too sick to travel by the time they realised what disease they had. Suddenly the man sat up alertly, looking shocked. My friend pulled me backwards just as the eruption of watery vomit struck the floor where I had been standing. I'll leave it there. I've been speaking for almost half an hour, which is far too long. You've done very well to stay awake, so congratulations on that. I'll finish off just with one very short passage, which talks about, again, this is rather personal, I'm afraid, but I feel it's a time to share this kind of material, which talks about how I felt to be leaving Zimbabwe, which, as I think many of you know, is a heartbreaking moment. As I have moved from Zimbabwe to Turkey, where I am now what the Foreign Office tactfully terms a trailing spouse, I've seen obvious differences. Having again such everyday things as water, electricity and a telephone, let alone a supermarket and broadband, is welcome. I just have to get out of the habit of buying things in huge quantities on the assumption that they won't be around tomorrow. That's actually true. The first time I went shopping in Ankara, I bought 64 toilet rolls. I just couldn't believe I would go back to the shop again tomorrow and they would all still be there. It was ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. But I've also come to realise how much tension and unhappiness I absorbed while in Zimbabwe. It is wonderful to be around people who have no fear, who say what they think and who are planning for long lives. I look back on so many Zimbabwe memories, but begin to understand that I ingested the country's sadness too. My feelings turn out to be a set of paradoxes. Zimbabwe feels safe, though there is no respect for the rule of law. It is a peaceful country, but when violence breaks out, it is savage and ruthless. It is a beautiful place, with areas of hideous ugliness. Zimbabweans are so brave, but can be such cowards too. There's incredible freedom in Zimbabwe, but civil liberties are denied. The land is rich and the rainfall is heavy, but nobody gets enough to eat. It is a society of the highest standards, but so many have slipped. People are highly educated, but schools are failing. It has been a great country, but so much that was good has passed away. I love Zimbabwe, but hate it too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philip, for a touching story about Zimbabwe. I think we've got all the insight, somewhat visualizing what they would think was happening when I was reading about this book. We want to thank you very, very much. Yes, thank you very much, Philip. Let me give to Pelagia to give some introductions, which we would have done before, but we had skipped in the process. So I'll give to Pelagia.
I'm not going to introduce anyone, but we've got people from different organizations which I can see. So maybe they can introduce themselves, their names and their organization, where they come from. I'll start with the Gill.
Bring my camera with me. I'm Gill. I work for an organisation called Leicester City of Sanctuary. Hopefully some of you have heard of it. We've been around for a few years now. It's all about making the local area, Leicester, Leicestershire, more understanding and more welcoming to asylum seekers and refugees. So we do a lot of work in schools. We talk to lots of people and help them understand the situation that asylum seekers have faced, are facing. And we also run various projects. So if anybody hasn't heard of us, wants to find out more, talk to myself or Carmel or other people in the room later on. And if anybody wants to get involved as volunteers, we're always looking for more volunteers. So a bit of a plug as well.
Hi, my name is Carmel O'Regan. I'm also from Leicester City of Sanctuary. I think Jill has said everything.
Hi, my name is Mo. I'm a development worker for Refugee Action, and basically I work with asylum seekers, refugees, and refugee community organisation. And I've been working very closely with Pelagia with the Leicester Drop-In Centre.
My name is Pablo Dafumane. I'm from Barclay Solicitors. We deal with a lot of asylum cases and immigration cases. We're based in Birmingham, and we're just here to hear what Philip is saying about Zimbabwe to assist our cases for asylum.
Hello, I've introduced myself already, but I'll do it again. So I'm Celia from LAS, so this is where we are, LAS. We work with people who are living with or affected by HIV, so that's one of the roles that we have. And we provide training and awareness raising about HIV. And we're actually training people to be community testers because we have a rapid HIV test kit which we've been using for about the last 18 months. And we're training people in different communities, and quite a lot of your community are training to be testers so that we can take it out into our communities, take it home when we can go home, so that people can know their status, because now it's much better to know if we get HIV, we don't get AIDS. Okay, so it isn't HIV AIDS anymore, it's HIV, know your status, and then move on from there. So we've got lots of information out the back, and if people want to learn how to become a tester so they can pass that on to people they know, then talk to us afterwards, okay?
Hello, my name is Myron Hines from Catch Number 2. I manage the Food and Support Service for Refugees, and that's from the onset when you get a decision right through to integration and towards independent living here in Leicester. So from getting a decision, positive decision, right through to claiming benefits, housing, just purely housing related support to enable you to live independently without going into crisis.
Thank you, everybody. When you're asking questions, it's possible if you say your name and where you come from so that we know who you are. So it's time for your questions to Philip. But please mention your name and the organization you are coming from. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Pelagia. Maybe we need a song to... Some of becoming a bit emotional, some are a bit worried now. We need to quench that so that if you ask Philip the questions, we are more relaxed in the same mode. Anybody give us a chorus to sing?
Well done, well done, well done. Well done, well done.
Thank you very much. Maybe Mario, your seat, you had reserved your seat up front here. Mr. Mario. We had reserved a seat for Mario from cage 22 here. There is seat up front here. Your seat was here. Anybody to start with on the questions? It's time for the questions now, and Philip will take up your questions. Yeah.
Can I ask a question? I'm Duncan Campbell, a Dominican priest from Holy Cross. In Eastern Europe, there was terrible tyranny, and one way the people began to get rid of it was they began to assemble in churches. A lot of people in Eastern Europe who never went to church suddenly started going to church, and they gained an awful lot of confidence and a lot of ability to start turning things over, like in Poland, of course, you know, with the shipyard and Gdansk and so on. Is there anything possible like that could happen in Zimbabwe with the churches?
Yeah. Okay. Very quickly, so, I mean, there are two main different. I mean, one is in Poland. I mean, I spent 3 years in Poland, so I know that terrain quite well. In Poland, there was a very large cohort of very militant anti-communist priests who led things with great authority. And even when some of them were killed, because the communists shot some of them, but even so, they carried on going and had a tremendous moral authority and also a singularity of purpose. They knew exactly what they wanted to do, get rid of communism. I think there are two things about Zimbabwe. And one is in Zimbabwe, the regime is less afraid to violate churches than they were in Poland. And we've seen terrible instances of churches being violated in Harare. church services being attacked. I mean, we all remember the setup of Archbishop Nube in Bulawayo. I mean, there's been a fairly consistent attack on the clergy and on church-going people. And also, of course, Mugabe has set up his own parallel clergy. He's created a lot of Anglican clergy who are loyal to him, people he rewards with patronage and so forth. So the church hasn't been able to exert the same moral leadership in Zimbabwe. But it's possible, and it would be good, but not yet.
Remember to just, are we all hearing at the back there? Are you all hearing? Yes. I will ask him to put a bit of volume. Even those who are asking questions, maybe if you can put a bit of energy in there, so that everyone will hear the questions. Any other question? Yes.
My name is Marian Rowe from Zimbabwean Association. I really understand what you were saying in your book and what you have experienced. My question is, do you think right now, especially asylum seekers, if we go home, we are going to be safe? Because sometimes the Home Office will tell us that, oh, well, there are thousands and thousands of pictures and things like that, so they won't even look about it. But as far as I know, Robert is very good at that, tracing things and finding out things because of his people there. And there are some of them, they are our neighbors who knew that this woman hasn't been here for years. And they know obvious that if you are not there for years, you are an asylum seeker, and we are the very people that are talking a lot about Zimbabwe. Do you think I will be safe to go there like now?
Good question, important question. I mean, in terms of the sophistication of the intelligence machinery and how he targets people and what he knows about it, I don't know. He never told me, I'm afraid. I'm not really too sure. But what I will say is this, and this is the serious answer to your question. As you can tell, in 2008, there was violence against people within the MDC and within civil society, very carefully targeted and picked because they belonged to those parties. But there was also a much more indiscriminate violence across large areas. I mean, whole provinces were attacked. I mean, I saw Manicaland, Mashvingo, parts of Mashonaland, really affected by a blanket violence, whole communities beaten, regardless of who voted which way. I mean, they couldn't possibly have known who voted which way. Whole communities targeted. Large numbers of houses burnt down, collective beatings, and people fleeing from their homes. I mean, really terrible scenes in a Zimbabwean context. Now, that happened in 2008. And as we know at the moment, there's a window of stability, although some of us perhaps prefer to call it an illusion of stability. But there is a window of stability at the moment. And my friends tell me, you know, life at the moment is not too bad. You know, there isn't massive political violence, although there are little signs of it. And there are things in the shops and so forth. But what I'm afraid of is this. We're talking about elections in 2011, right? Now, what's changed between 2008 and 2011? Nothing's changed. Nothing's changed. I mean, the motivation of those old men to stay in power is just as fierce as it's ever been. They know they're unpopular, they want to stay in power, and they have the capability to use violence to make sure they win the election again. So what have we learned from history? They're going to do it. I mean, I tell you, as sure as a train ploughing towards the buffers is going to hit them, you know, this is a train crash just about to happen. In 2011, if the elections happen, they will be violent, and in 3 years' time, you'll have some guy standing up like me with his book, Zimbabwe 2011, Years of Hope and Despair, telling you the terrible stories about what happened in 2011. That is what's going to happen.
Another question? Yes.
I'm William Kandago from ZA. We heard those sad stories of 2008. You being a senior government official.
Senior, ha ha ha. That's a good one.
You being a government official, can I ask you, what would you recommend to the government today? Because there are so many people around here who are being said it's time for you to go back. Whereas, like she said earlier on, she doesn't feel comfortable. Yeah. But the government is saying, you're right to go back home. What would you recommend to the government?
It's a very good question. I mean, again, just as Mr. Mugabe hasn't told me about his his intelligence, but Mr. Cameron hasn't yet called and asked my opinion about what he should be doing, with Zimbabwe. But if Mr. Cameron did, then what I would say to him is, all I can say is what I know. I mean, I was there for 3.5 years, and I've described exactly how it was. And if you can really imagine that that's a country fit to live in, then I think you have a fairly active imagination. That's really all I can say. It's very kind of you to call me a senior government official. That's wonderful. That's wonderful. I was just as flattered because my publisher's website calls me a young person, which I think is great. Because it's many years since I thought of myself as young. So
Was it once you were representing Britain? That's why they said you're a government official.
Well, yes, it was true. I was once a government official, but the idea I was a senior government official is great.
That's a good promotion for Phil.
My name is Andrew Boy. I represent the Christians Aware. I came from Zimbabwe in 2007. I know what he had been talking about. I was already experiencing it. And I find what is happening in Zimbabwe is what happened in Congo, in Burundi.
Maybe you can speak up for the people in the back to hear.
Many places suffered the same problem. But the international community went in by sending the United Nations forces to try and bring peace in that particular country. What are they thinking about Zimbabwe about this? Because as you say, there is already going to be problems in 2011.
Yeah.
What is the international community doing? Because when Tsvangirai came into power, he had no army of himself. And Mugabe had politicized all the security forces for himself.
Absolutely.
Now, what is going to happen? Basically, Tsvangirai can take up arms against Mugabe. What is the international community going to do about it?
Good question. I mean, there are two. I'd like to offer a comment first and then try and answer your question. I mean, first of all, people often say, oh, what happened in Zimbabwe, it must be similar to what happened in Congo or something like that. No, there's a huge difference. There is a huge difference. I mean, when has Congo ever known a first world education system? When has it ever had excellent infrastructure? When has it had roads and electricity cables and railway lines and shops and industries and businesses and schools and a healthcare system and water treatment? Never. It's never had any of those things. But in Zimbabwe, what you had was a first world country. A country of the highest standards, which has been pushed down. I mean, Congo, I think we all feel sympathy for the situation in that country, but we recognise that actually in Congo, things have never got us above a certain basic level. But in Zimbabwe, think, 12 years ago, things were of the highest standard, and they've collapsed. And that's what's for me the really painful tragedy of it. Such a sophisticated country brought down. What is the international community doing? It's a very good question, and there's quite a painful and difficult answer. I mean, the obvious answer is nothing. I mean, that's the obvious answer to your question. Why is nothing really happening? It is because the Southern African region is giving the world a clear message that Zimbabwe is a problem which belongs to it. The Southern African development community is telling the world, it's telling the UK, it's telling the United States, it's telling everybody, back off. This is our problem and we're going to solve it. We're going to find a solution to Zimbabwe which is an African solution, whatever that means, and it's a solution that's arranged locally. Now, if you want my personal view, I think what they've done is morally inadequate. I think what they've done is ineffective. They've obviously failed to resolve the problems which Zimbabwe has and to bring back some kind of prosperity, to bring back respect for human rights, to bring back law and order. None of that has happened. So really they've been ineffective. But we are in a position where very powerful countries, South Africa obviously is an extremely powerful country, and they are telling us, back out. We don't want your help. Steer clear. And actually the other regional countries are saying exactly the same. Botswana, Malawi, Zambia, Mozambique. They all say, Southern African problem, Southern African solution. Britain, go away.
At the back there.
Hello, David Gorod. I'm sorry I came late. I don't know if we discussed these things earlier, but last night you may have seen the Channel 4 programme about exported tilapia to this country, millions of pounds worth. What is your view on the question of trade sanctions or otherwise between this country, Western countries, and Zimbabwe?
And broadly speaking, I mean, that people often say this, and I think they're trying to draw parallels between the apartheid situation, the apartheid era situation, and now. There is one crucial difference. During the apartheid years, what was the ANC calling for all the time? Sanctions. Yeah? The ANC was always saying, we want sanctions against apartheid South Africa to break this racist regime. They were very clear about that. I remember I once got the honour of going on Question Time when Robin Day was on it, and I asked a question. This was back in 1984, so you can see I'm not young at all. This was back in 1984. And my question, Mrs. Thatcher at that time was opposing sanctions against apartheid, and Winnie Mandela, who was the only one out of prison, was calling for sanctions. Okay, so that was why, in my view, it would have been right to put sanctions on apartheid South Africa. Now, who in Zimbabwe is calling for sanctions? No one. Right, no one. I mean, the MDC isn't calling for sanctions, civil society isn't calling for sanctions. So in my view, there's no case for it. I mean, if the forces which are pushing for change in Zimbabwe don't see that as a constructive step forward, then in my view it's wrong for we Brits to say, you must have sanctions.
Another hand at the back there.
Hi, my name is Mariam Sarurwa, and I'm an entrepreneur, so I work for myself. I have a few friends who are trying to mobilize a few business people my age, the youngsters, to try and get back home and start somewhere. What's your view, or what's the future for Zimbabwe economy-wise? Because we want to go in, but we're not sure if it's the right time to dig in with the little bit of money we've put together. But we really want to do something different, something new, help the economy, help build, something and get employment come back in for the locals. So I'm in a position where I'm not sure where to go, where to start. Shall I not? So what's your future opinion for the economy?
Wow. Well, first of all, I think you're fantastic. I think that's really magnificent. I think it's a great idea. I think the medium-term potential for Zimbabwe is almost infinite. I mean, it has exceptional resources. As I was saying in that piece, I mean, it has, the greatest land in the world. You can grow anything in Zimbabwe. Wonderful rainfall. It's a very fertile place. It's a great base for industry. It's right at the heart of that region, near to this huge market in South Africa. And the labour force there, I'm talking to you as a business person now, the labour force is exceptionally gifted, exceptionally talented, exceptionally well educated. And of course the economy is actually quite depressed at the moment. So it's actually a very good time to make an investment, buy some assets and so on. But having said that, it would remain in the short term quite risky, because until this cohort of hideous old men is gone, there is not going to be a reliable environment for business people, because there is no rule of law. If somebody comes and steals your investment, if somebody rocks up at your door one day and says, "This business of yours, it now belongs to me," there is nothing you can do. You can try going to court. You might even win. You might even get a court order. The court order will be ignored. The police won't enforce it. And that is a large and unquantifiable risk. And that's actually what's deterring most businesses from going back into Zimbabwe. A lot of people are seeing opportunities and would like to go back, but are scared of the lack of rule of law.
Jafumane from Back and Call. I just want to thank you, Philip, for quite a very good picture of the situation in Zimbabwe leading to the elections of 2008. First of all, I think I've got about 2 or 3 questions. To what extent? First of all, to what extent can we quote your book in terms of our arguments in court, in terms of arguing for cases, for those that are failing their asylum cases in Zimbabwe? That's the first That's the first, okay, that's the first thing.
Yeah.
To what extent can we quote your book as authoritative for the situation in Zimbabwe? And secondly, there is, and there has been, I'm sure most people are aware of the fact-finding mission in Zimbabwe, which has been released by the Home Office. I do have a copy of it. It seems to be painting a picture that the situation in Zimbabwe has changed to the extent that people can actually return back to Zimbabwe without any fear of persecution. Several failed asylum seekers have been interviewed and they've all said the situation is okay. In your view, looking at obviously your experiences and what the fact-finding mission in Zimbabwe, which was released in August this year, how do you sort of correlate the two situations? And thirdly, looking at a situation where we can, obviously your book still remains authoritative as far as that is concerned.
I'm glad you think so.
And to what extent can we, if that is possible, engage your services in terms of getting a report, specifically be it an individual report or a collective report, in terms of the future risks upon return to Zimbabwe? We are looking at a situation where possibly people could face future risks, but obviously the Home Office will be saying possibly because of their profile now or previous profile and things like credibility, they will be saying, look here, we don't see any problems, but what are the future risks of those that have been away from us?
Okay, excellent question. I mean, first of all, in terms of quoting it, quote the whole thing. For all I can. I mean, it's a book that's been published in the UK. You know, it's by me. You know, I had the role I had as a British diplomat in Zimbabwe at that time. You know, quote the whole thing. That's fine. No problem. But you do have to buy a copy first. In terms of fact, I don't know. I haven't read the fact-finding report, and I don't know it. All I would say, I mean, I can't really add very much to what I've said already, which is I was there from 2006 to 2009. You know, I saw what things were like, and I've written it down as clearly as I can. And if the world chooses to ignore that, then, you know, that's frustrating. In terms of what's happening now, I mean, as I've said, there are my contacts in Harare tell me that things are substantially better than they were in 2008 because there's no violence, you know, there's no indiscriminate violence. The economy has picked up a fair bit. There are now goods in all the shops because you pay for them with US dollars. So if you've got US dollars, life in Zimbabwe is, you know, is currently not too bad. But as I've said to the lady there, my firm belief is that what I've seen here, which after all, let's face it, is a repetition of what we saw in 2002 and 2005. Yeah, you don't need to be a university graduate to see the sequence here. 2002, 2005, 2008. Add on 3 more years. Yeah. Unless something dramatic changes, and I'm talking about divine intervention on a quite miraculous scale, which maybe some of the chorus leaders could help us deliver, but unless, without that kind of dramatic divine intervention, there is going to be something like I've described happening quite soon in Zimbabwe. So there it is. Yeah.